Tonight, we continue our journey through the history of Britain. In the last chapter, we explored the rise and fall of Roman Britain, and how the Roman Empire slowly withdrew from the island. Now we move into a quieter and more uncertain time, a time when new people arrived from across the sea, and small kingdoms began to form across the land. This is the story of Anglo-Saxon England, a calm journey through the early medieval world, designed to help you relax and unwind. So, settle in, get comfortable, and let's slowly step into Britain after the Romans. When the Roman Empire withdrew from Britain in the early 5th century, the island did not change all at once. There was no single moment where everything suddenly stopped. Instead, change came slowly, almost quietly. At first, many of the structures left behind by the Romans remained in place. The towns still stood. The roads still stretched across the land. And in some areas, people continued living much as they had before. But without Roman soldiers and officials, the system that had held Britain together began to weaken. There was no longer a central authority to organize defense, no Roman army to protect towns and settlements. Local communities now had to rely on themselves. In some towns, life continued for a time. Markets still operated. People still traded goods. But over the years, many of these towns began to shrink. Public buildings fell into disrepair. Bathhouses, once filled with activity, grew quiet. Stone structures were slowly abandoned, or taken apart so the materials could be reused elsewhere. The carefully organized Roman way of life began to fade. In the countryside, people adapted more easily. Farming continued much as it always had. Fields were planted, animals were raised, families worked the land just as they had done for generations. But even here, change was beginning. Without Roman control, the island became more vulnerable. Raids from across the sea became more frequent. Groups from northern Europe began to appear along the eastern and southern coasts. Some came as raiders, others came seeking new land to settle. At first, these groups were small, but over time their presence grew. Meanwhile, within Britain itself, local leaders began to emerge. Without Roman governors, power shifted to regional rulers. Some may have been former Roman officials. Others were local war leaders who organized defense against raids. These leaders controlled small territories. They built alliances, and in some cases, they fought each other for power. Britain was no longer a single, organized province. It had become a patchwork of smaller regions, each with its own authority. Communication between areas became more difficult. Trade with the wider world declined. Goods that had once been imported from across the Roman Empire became harder to obtain. Life became more local, more focused on the immediate surroundings. Over time, knowledge of Roman systems began to fade. The use of Latin declined. Written records became less common. Many skills and practices introduced during the Roman period were gradually lost. Historians sometimes refer to this period as the early medieval period. It is often described as a time of transition, a bridge between the structured world of Roman Britain and the new societies that would soon emerge. But it was not simply a time of decline. It was also a time of change. New cultures were beginning to take shape, new languages would develop, and new kingdoms would rise across the island. The Britain that had once been part of the Roman Empire was slowly transforming. Its identity was shifting, and along the coasts, new arrivals were becoming more frequent. These newcomers would soon play a major role in shaping the future of the island. They would become known as the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes, and their arrival would mark the beginning of a new chapter in the story of Britain. As life in Britain continued to change after the Romans left, new groups of people began arriving from across the sea. They came from regions that are now part of northern Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands. These people would later be known as the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes. At first, their arrival was gradual. Small groups landed along the eastern and southern coasts of Britain. Some came as raiders, attacking coastal settlements and then leaving again. Others came for a different reason. They were looking for land. Over time, more groups arrived, and instead of returning home, many began to settle. They brought with them their own customs, languages, and ways of life. The world they came from was different from Roman Britain. They did not build large stone towns. Instead, they lived in small, wooden settlements. Homes were simple structures made from timber, with thatched roofs and earthen floors. These settlements were often built near rivers or fertile land where farming was possible. As more Anglo-Saxon groups settled, their presence grew stronger. They did not simply join the existing population. In many areas, they replaced it. Some local communities may have moved westward, toward regions like Wales and Cornwall. Others may have lived alongside the newcomers for a time. But gradually, the culture of the Anglo-Saxons began to dominate much of eastern and southern Britain. The language they spoke would later develop into what we now know as Old English. Many everyday words used in English today can be traced back to this period. Simple words like house, bread, and water all have Anglo-Saxon origins. Place names across England also reflect this influence. Names ending in ham, tun, or ing often come from Anglo-Saxon settlements. These names described villages, farms, or groups of people living in a particular area. As these communities grew, they began to organize themselves into territories. Each group was led by a chief or war leader. These leaders were responsible for protecting their people and securing land. Over time, these territories would develop into early kingdoms. Life for the Anglo-Saxon settlers was closely tied to the land. Farming remained central. Families worked together to grow crops and raise animals. Woodlands were used for hunting and gathering. Rivers provided water and a means of travel. Craftsmanship was also important. Metalworkers produced tools and weapons. Carpenters built homes and farming equipment. Weavers created clothing from wool. Daily life was simple but structured. Communities were small, and people depended on one another. At the center of many settlements stood a large hall. This hall served as a gathering place. Here, people shared meals, told stories, and listened to their leaders. It was a place of warmth, especially during long winters. Unlike the Romans, the Anglo-Saxons did not rely heavily on written records. Much of their culture was passed down through spoken stories. These stories often told of heroes, battles, and journeys. One of the most famous of these stories is Beowulf, an epic tale that has survived from this period. Religion during the early Anglo-Saxon period was based on pagan beliefs. People worshipped multiple gods, often connected to nature and the forces of the world around them. Some days of the week in modern English still reflect these beliefs. For example, Thursday comes from Thor's Day, named after a Norse god. Although Norse mythology is more commonly associated with later Viking culture, there were shared elements in early Germanic beliefs. As Anglo-Saxon settlements expanded, the landscape of Britain continued to change. The old Roman towns became less important in many areas. New villages appeared across the countryside. The structure of society shifted from Roman organization to smaller, local communities. This was not a sudden transformation. It happened gradually over many years. But by the end of this period, much of Britain had been reshaped.
The influence of the Anglo-Saxons was now firmly established, and from these growing settlements, a new political landscape would begin to form. Small territories would develop into larger kingdoms, and these kingdoms would compete for power across the island. This would lead to the next stage in the story of Anglo-Saxon England, the rise of the early kingdoms.
As Anglo-Saxon settlements grew across Britain, small territories gradually developed into larger and more organized kingdoms. These kingdoms were not united. Each one had its own ruler, its own people, and its own ambitions. Over time, several of these kingdoms became especially powerful. Historians often refer to this group as the Heptarchy, meaning the 7 kingdoms. Although the exact number could change, 7 major kingdoms are traditionally recognized. These were Northumbria, Mercia, Wessex, East Anglia, Essex, Kent, and Sussex. Each kingdom controlled its own land and people. Each had its own ruler, often referred to as a king, and each competed with the others for influence and control. In the north of England, the Kingdom of Northumbria stretched across a large area. It included lands that had once been separate regions, eventually brought together under one rule. Northumbria became known for its centers of learning and religion, which would grow in importance later. Further south, the Kingdom of Mercia rose to power. Located in the central part of England, Mercia was well positioned. It controlled important land routes and fertile farmland. For a time, Mercia became one of the most dominant kingdoms. Its rulers extended their influence over neighboring regions, shaping the balance of power across the island. To the south, the Kingdom of Wessex began to grow. At first, it was just one of several smaller kingdoms. But over time, Wessex would become increasingly important. Its rulers would eventually play a major role in unifying parts of England. Along the eastern coast lay East Anglia, a kingdom connected closely to the sea. Its position made it open to trade, but also vulnerable to future invasions. Further south, smaller kingdoms such as Essex, Kent, and Sussex developed. These kingdoms were among the earlier Anglo-Saxon settlements. Kent, in particular, became important due to its location close to mainland Europe. Trade and communication across the Channel were more common here. Although these kingdoms existed side by side, they were not peaceful neighbors. Conflict was common. Kings sought to expand their territory and increase their power. Alliances were formed and then broken. Battles were fought over land, resources, and influence. Yet alongside conflict, there was also cooperation. Trade routes connected different regions. Ideas and cultural practices spread between kingdoms. Over time, a shared Anglo-Saxon identity began to form. Each kingdom was ruled by a king, but power did not rest with him alone. Kings were supported by groups of warriors and advisors. These warriors were loyal to their leader, often rewarded with land or treasure for their service. This system created strong bonds between rulers and their followers. At the center of each kingdom were settlements and royal halls. These halls were places where kings gathered with their warriors. Feasts were held, stories were told, decisions were made about alliances, disputes, and future actions. Life in these halls was both social and political. It was where leadership was displayed and reinforced. Beyond the halls, most people lived simple lives. Farmers worked the land. Families raised children. Communities grew slowly across the countryside. But above this quiet daily life, the larger picture was one of constant change. Power shifted from one kingdom to another. A strong king in one region could rise quickly and fall just as quickly. No single kingdom controlled all of England during this early period. Instead, the island remained divided, a collection of competing powers, each shaping its own future. This balance would continue for many years, but over time certain kingdoms would begin to dominate. and from this competition, stronger and more organized systems of rule would begin to emerge. The story of Anglo-Saxon England was still developing, and the lives of its people, both rulers and ordinary families, would continue to shape the land in quiet but lasting ways. For most people living in Anglo-Saxon England, life was simple, steady, and closely tied to the land. Far from the power struggles between kingdoms, daily life followed a quiet and familiar rhythm. Most people lived in small villages, surrounded by fields and open countryside. Homes were built from wood, with walls made of woven branches covered in clay, and roofs thatched with straw. These buildings were simple, but practical. Inside, a central fire provided warmth and a place to cook food. There were no chimneys. Smoke slowly drifted upward and escaped through the roof. The air inside would have been warm, but often filled with the faint smell of wood smoke. Furniture was basic. Wooden benches, stools, and simple tables filled the space. Families slept on straw-filled mattresses or animal skins laid across the floor. Life began early each day. At sunrise, people would start their work. Farming was at the center of daily life. Fields were divided into long strips, each worked by different families within the village. Crops such as wheat, barley, and oats were grown. Vegetables like cabbage, beans, and onions were also common. Farmers used simple tools made from wood and iron. Plows were pulled by oxen, slowly turning the soil. Work in the fields depended on the seasons. In spring, seeds were planted. In summer, crops grew under long daylight hours. Autumn was the time of harvest. This was one of the busiest periods of the year, as food needed to be gathered and stored for winter. Winter brought a slower pace. Fields lay quiet. People spent more time indoors, repairing tools, weaving cloth, and preparing for the months ahead. Animals were an important part of village life. Cattle were kept for milk and labor. Sheep provided wool for clothing. Pigs were often allowed to roam freely through woodlands, feeding on roots and fallen acorns. Food was simple but filling. Bread was a staple, made from ground grain. Stews and soups were common, made from vegetables, herbs, and sometimes meat. Fish was eaten in areas near rivers or the coast. Meals were often shared, bringing families and communities together. Clothing was made from wool and linen. Women spun thread and wove cloth using simple looms. Garments were designed for warmth and durability rather than style. Cloaks were commonly worn, fastened with brooches made from metal. Shoes were made from leather, offering protection from the often damp ground. In each village, there was a strong sense of community. People depended on one another. Work was often shared. Neighbors helped each other during planting and harvest. At the center of some settlements stood a larger building known as the hall. This hall belonged to the local lord or leader. It was a place for gatherings, feasts, and important discussions. Here, people would come together to share food, listen to stories, and celebrate special occasions. Storytelling was an important part of Anglo-Saxon culture. Without widespread writing, history and traditions were passed down through spoken words. Stories of heroes, journeys, and battles were told around fires. These stories helped preserve the identity of the community. Children grew up learning these tales, passing them on to the next generation. Religion during the early Anglo-Saxon period was based on pagan beliefs. People worshipped multiple gods, often connected to nature, war, and the forces of the world around them. Sacred places might include forests, springs, or open land. Rituals and offerings were made to seek protection, good harvests, and success in life. Over time, new religious ideas would begin to spread. But in these early years, traditional beliefs remained strong. Life was not always easy. Weather could affect crops. Food shortages could occur. Illness was difficult to treat. But despite these challenges, communities adapted. They found ways to survive and support one another. The pace of life was slower than in Roman times. There were fewer large towns, less connection to distant lands. But there was also a strong connection to the land itself, to the changing seasons, to the daily routines that shaped each year. For most people, this was the world they knew, a quiet life of work, family, and community. And while kings and kingdoms rose and fell across the island, the lives of ordinary people continued steadily, day by day, season by season, shaping the foundations of Anglo-Saxon England. In the early years of Anglo-Saxon England, religion was deeply connected to the natural world. People followed pagan beliefs, worshipping many gods rather than one. These gods were often linked to forces of nature, such as the sky, storms, war, and fertility. Life was uncertain, and these beliefs helped people make sense of the world around them. Important events like harvests, battles, and changes in weather were often seen as influenced by these gods. Rituals and offerings were made to seek protection, success, and good fortune. Sacred places were not always buildings. They could be forests, rivers, or open land. Certain locations were believed to hold spiritual significance. People would gather in these places for ceremonies and celebrations. One of the most well-known gods in Anglo-Saxon belief was Woden. He was associated with wisdom, war, and leadership. Another was Thunor, a god connected to thunder. These names may sound unfamiliar, but they still exist in modern language. For example, Wednesday comes from Woden's Day, and Thursday comes from Thunor's Day, which later became linked to the Norse god Thor. Religion was part of everyday life. It shaped how people understood the world and how they lived within it. But over time, a new belief system began to arrive in Britain. This belief system was Christianity. Christianity had already spread across parts of the former Roman Empire. Even during Roman Britain, there had been small Christian communities. But after the Romans left, these communities became less visible. The reintroduction of Christianity into Anglo-Saxon England began gradually. One important moment came in the year 597 AD. A Christian missionary named Augustine arrived in the Kingdom of Kent. He had been sent by the Pope in Rome. His goal was to spread Christian teachings among the Anglo-Saxon people. At first, this was a quiet effort. Augustine met with the King of Kent, King Ethelbert. The king allowed him to stay and share his beliefs. Over time, the king himself converted to Christianity. This was an important turning point. When a king accepted Christianity, it often influenced others to follow. From Kent, Christianity began to spread to other kingdoms. Missionaries traveled across the land. They established churches and places of worship. Over time, monasteries were built. These monasteries became important centers of learning. Monks lived and worked there, dedicating their lives to study, prayer, and writing. They copied manuscripts by hand, preserving knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. These quiet places became some of the most important cultural centers in Anglo-Saxon England. The spread of Christianity did not happen instantly. For many years, pagan and Christian beliefs existed side by side. Some people continued to follow older traditions. Others adopted the new religion. Gradually, Christianity became more widely accepted. Churches began to appear in towns and villages. Religious leaders played a growing role in society. Festivals and traditions changed. New customs were introduced. Old ones slowly faded or were adapted. The introduction of Christianity also brought connections to the wider world. Through the Church, Anglo-Saxon England became linked to other Christian regions in Europe. Ideas, knowledge, and cultural practices traveled between these places. This helped shape the development of society during this period. For ordinary people, these changes were experienced slowly. Daily life remained focused on farming, family, and community. But over time, religion began to shape how people viewed the world and their place within it. The quiet transformation from pagan beliefs to Christianity was one of the most important changes in Anglo-Saxon England. It influenced culture, learning, and leadership for generations to come. And as these changes continued, new centers of power began to emerge across the island. Among them, one kingdom would begin to rise above the others. That kingdom was Wessex. As the kingdoms of Anglo-Saxon England continued to grow and compete, power did not remain equal between them. Over time, certain kingdoms became stronger than others. Among these, one in particular began to rise steadily. This was the Kingdom of Wessex, located in the south of England. At first, Wessex was just one of several kingdoms. It did not dominate the land. It faced pressure from neighboring regions and from internal challenges. But gradually its position began to strengthen. The rulers of Wessex worked to expand their territory. They formed alliances and fought battles to secure land and influence. Like other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, Wessex was led by kings who relied on loyal warriors and advisors. These warriors formed the king's household god, protecting him and supporting his rule. In return, they were rewarded with land, wealth, and status. This system helped maintain loyalty and stability within the kingdom. Leadership during this time required both strength and careful decision-making. A king needed to defend his territory, but also manage relationships with neighboring rulers. Alliances could bring peace, but they could also shift quickly. Conflict between kingdoms remained common. Battles were fought over land, resources, and power. Yet over time, Wessex began to stand out. Its rulers were able to maintain control and expand their influence more effectively than many others. One of the most well-known early kings associated with Wessex is Egbert. In the early 9th century, Egbert became king and worked to strengthen the position of Wessex. Through a combination of military success and political strategy, he gained influence over other kingdoms. Although he did not unite all of England, his rule marked an important step toward greater consolidation of power. Wessex became one of the leading kingdoms on the island. Its growing strength set the stage for future developments. At the same time, the wider landscape of Britain was continuing to change. New challenges were beginning to emerge, particularly from across the sea. Raids along the coasts were becoming more frequent. New groups were arriving, bringing with them different skills, beliefs, and ways of life. These groups would soon have a major impact on Anglo-Saxon England. But within Wessex, foundations were being laid. Structures of leadership were becoming stronger. Territory was being secured. And the idea of a more unified England was beginning to take shape, even if only in its earliest form. For ordinary people, life continued much as it always had. Fields were worked, villages grew slowly, communities remained focused on daily routines. Yet above this quiet way of life, the balance of power was shifting. Wessex was rising, and in the years to come, it would play a central role in shaping the future of England. The story of Anglo-Saxon England was still unfolding, and the next chapter would bring new challenges, new arrivals, and a new period of change across the island, a time often remembered as the Viking Age. And that brings us to the end of this chapter of Britain's story. From the uncertain years after the Romans left, to the arrival of the Anglo-Saxons, and the rise of early kingdoms across the land, a new way of life slowly took shape, one built on small communities, changing beliefs, and growing power. In the next part of our journey, we'll explore the arrival of a new force from across the sea, the Vikings, and how they would reshape Britain once again. If you enjoy calm history like this, you can subscribe for more long, relaxing journeys through the past. For now, thank you for listening, and have a peaceful night.